Iran today is somewhat of a paradox politically. On the one hand, the country seems to be on the brink of revolution as massive protests erupt every few years. But on the other hand, it has brilliantly maneuvered itself to become one of the most powerful nations in the Middle East. The Ayatollahs maintain a theocracy with an iron grip, but huge segments of the country wish to see a liberalisation of its society. To understand how it could function as a chaotic yet competent state, we have to delve into its 19th and 20th century history, a period in which the country experienced the lowest of lows, famine, civil war, and foreign occupation, but also the highest of highs, strong leaders, nation building, and of course the black liquid gold that is oil. Capturing the entire history of Iran for the last few centuries in detail will be too laborious of a task, so instead, in this feature-length documentary, I will cover the period through a case study of its three major revolutions: the unprecedented constitutional revolution of 1906, Mossadegh's reforms of 1951, and the now infamous Islamic Revolution of 1979. We will see on each occasion how a nation was driven to revolutionary action as a result of its leaders' incompetence and humiliation at the hands of imperial powers, how revolutionary collaborators turned on each other, and how a nation could go from elation at a brighter future to dismay when greed corrupted the exercise of power and saw freedom being stolen by those who proclaimed to be its purveyors. The 19th century was a period of crisis for Persia. The royal dynasty in charge, the Qajars, had lost two wars early on to the Russian Empire, losing Armenia and Azerbaijan in the process. In the east, the Afghans had cemented their rule over the city of Herat. Whilst their adversaries, the Ottomans, were instituting reforms to streamline their administration, the Qajars were falling behind, with their governance model relying on a highly decentralized system that was prone to extreme corruption. According to a survey from the British Foreign Office at the time, there are large tracts of fertile land which remain waste owing to their proximity to the main roads, as no village having cultivators on such spots can possibly prosper or enjoy the least immunity from the pestering visits of government officials and thefts and robberies committed by the tribes. Ordinary Persians were not oblivious to their government's ineffectiveness, especially since European imperial powers were imposing their will and domination on the country. In 1872, Nasir al-Din Shah Qajar signed a contract with Paul Reuter, a British businessman and founder of Reuters news agency, that saw the Iranian ruler concede control over Persian roads, factories, extraction of resources, amongst other things, in exchange for 60% of net revenue and a fixed sum. British statesman Lord Curzon called it the most complete and extraordinary surrender of the entire industrial resources of a kingdom into foreign hands that has probably ever been dreamed of, much less accomplished in history. Thankfully for Iran, public outrage reached the point that the Shah was forced to back down. Some 20 years later, however, the same long-ruling Nasir al-Din Shah was forced to renege on another foolish and humiliating concession. This time he allowed Englishman Major G.F. Talbot complete monopolization on the production, sale and export of tobacco. Much of Persian society consumed tobacco, so it affected almost all of the country. In addition, certain segments of the Bazaris, the merchant class, had their livelihoods dependent on the cash crop. Fearing for their job security, the Bazaris protested. They allied themselves with the ulama, the religious clergy, to form a powerful alliance that would serve as the bedrock of all future revolutionary episodes inside the country. Mirza Shirazi, the most important religious authority in the country, issued a fatwa against the use of tobacco. Persian society was galvanized. almost immediately there was a near-total boycott of tobacco use, as Persians demonstrated their desperate determination by foregoing one of their favorite pastimes. Within 2 months, the Shah was forced to rebuke the agreement. But the damage had likely been done already. Persians across all strands of society became convinced that their rulers were incompetent and did not have their best interests at heart. Something had to change. In 1896, while preparing celebrations for the 50th anniversary of his reign, Nasr al-Din Shah was assassinated by a bankrupt trader who had studied under Jamaluddin Afghani. The new monarch, Muzaffar al-Din Shah, continued in his father's footsteps by mismanaging the country's finances. In 1901, he sold a monopoly over oil exploration in central and southern Persia to British businessman William Darcy. This deal would play a big role in precipitating the revolutionary politics of Muhammad Mossadegh some 4 decades later. At the same time, tariffs on native merchants were increased, and the Shah took out massive loans from Britain and Russia to pay for the government's expenditure. To appease his European lenders, Muzaffar al-Din Shah appointed Monsieur Naus, a Belgian, as the country's Director General of Customs. For the typical Iranian, they could not understand why their ruler was helping the Europeans at the expense of Iranians. Mind-bogglingly, Muzaffar al-Din Shah also relaxed controls over censorship, allowing for the proliferation of liberal newspapers and general political expression. As Persia and the wider Islamic world was experiencing a crisis in governance, or perhaps as a result of it, new political ideas were emerging that promised reform and vigor. The Dar al-Fanun and the Faculty of Law and Political Science became hubs for the production of these ideas. Whilst the Qajar's attempt at reform and modernization was largely pitiful at best, they did set up a few modern education institutions that went on to shape young intellectuals. As such, a growing voice emerged within Persian intelligentsia that believed the constitution should be a prerequisite for the stability and prosperity of their nation, a basic charter which defined the laws and identity of the state. All the European countries had them after all, and they were doing really well. This voice believed the constitution would hold the ruler to a certain standard and prevent a weak government that struggles to function. With so much of the nation united by a disdain for the inefficiencies and corruption of the government, and with the backing of such important segments of society, the Bazaris had numbers and money, the ulama had even more numbers, and their moral prestige afforded them great respect and thus authority, not to forget the burgeoning intelligentsia that gave them political vernacular and direction. By the turn of the 20th century, the conditions for revolution were in place: incompetent governance, foreign enemies who constantly humiliated the nation, and popular forces that desperately wanted change. Now all that was needed was a spark. Early on in 1905, the country would face a sharp economic crisis. There was a poor harvest, which for an agrarian society like Persia was devastating. The suffering was compounded by events in neighboring Russia. Despite being one of the most feared empires, Russia's domestic affairs were in disarray. No amount of imperial grandeur could cover up the fact that many ordinary Russians experienced a standard of living comparable to the poor, weak countries it was conquering. So when the Japanese humiliated Russia in their war of 1905, ordinary Russians saw their opportunity to rise up in revolt against the Tsar. Not only did this spur on the Persian political ideologues, considering the only Asian state with a constitution had defeated the only major European state without one, the disruption caused by events in Russia severely impacted trade also. Food prices rose drastically in all the major cities. At the same time, a cholera epidemic broke out. The desperation of the country's citizens was perfectly captured by a local cleric when he addressed Qajar authorities.
عالی حضرت، حوزه شما رو به وخامت است. بندگان شما به گدایی تقلیل یافتند. آنها مورد ظلم و استثمار فرمانداران و مقاماتی هستند که طعم و تشنگی خون آنها حد و مرز ندارد. سال گذشته مالیات دهندگانی که نمی توانستند پول نقد پرداخت کنند مجبور شدند دختران خود را به ترکمنها و بازرگانان ارمنی بفروشند و سپس آنها را به بردگی در روسیه فروختند. هزاران بندگان شما مجبور شده اند از این ظلم فرار کنند و به روسیه مهاجرت کنند. اگر چاره ای اندیشیده نشود کشور از بین خواهد رفت. سیستان و بلوچستان را انگلیسی ها تصرف خواهند کرد، روس ها بخشای دیگر و عثمانی ها طرحهای خاص خود را دارند. عالی حضرت، به مصیبت 15 میلیون روحی که در ترس زندگی شدند، تصوت بیگانگان زندگی می کنند گوش دهید.
Iranians had had enough. Protests began in June 1905, at first as peaceful processions whereby shopkeepers communicated their requests to the government, which were to dismiss Monsieur Naus and to repay the loans the government had borrowed from small business owners. Even though Muzaffar al-Din Shah initially seemed willing to fulfill these wishes, which led to reduced protests, it quickly became apparent that he had no intention of following up on them. Subsequently, public dissent resumed all throughout the year and into 1906. In the summer of that year, the police shot dead a religious student, causing a chain of events that saw tensions and violence escalate. In July 1906, two merchants traveled to the British legation in Tehran to seek bast, a custom respected since ancient times that was equivalent to sanctuary or asylum. The number of the basti grew to 14,000 within a few weeks. The British diplomats watched with astonishment as the gardens of their embassy were transformed into what an Iranian eyewitness called one vast open-air school of political science, as dangerous new ideas were freely discussed, whilst lectures were given on different European constitutional systems. With the trio of forces responsible for spearheading all three of Iran's 20th century revolutions, the Bazaris, the ulama, and the liberal intellectuals, it felt as if this round of protests would be different from previous ones that seemed smaller in scope and ambition. On August 5th, the Shah appointed a senior official with liberal views as Prime Minister and signed a proclamation convening a Constituent National Assembly. A few months later, elections were held for the Majlis, as the assembly was known. On December 30th, 1906, the Shah signed the constitution, which was modelled on the Belgian constitution. The protesters had won, but the real struggle to implement change would now begin. Almost immediately, there was an explosion of intellectual and political activity. Dozens of radical newspapers and political organizations appeared. Within the Majlis, three main political factions emerged: the Royalists, who were few and grossly unpopular; the Moderates, who formed the vast majority and received valuable support from the Bazari community, as well as key ulama like Ayatollahs Tabatabai and Behbahani; and the Liberals, who represented the small but assertive intelligentsia. Only a few days after the constitution was ratified, the Shah died and was succeeded by his son Muhammad Ali. Unfortunately for most of the Majlis, the new Shah wanted to restore the absolutism of his grandfather Nasr al-Din Shah. The two forces clashed on what the exact nature of the new government should look like, with the Majlis seeking to dilute royal authority as much as possible, whilst Muhammad Ali Shah wanted to reinstate autocratic rule. Dismayed by the resistance of the new monarch, protests erupted once again throughout Iran. The protesters were in no mood to go back to Qajar despotism and showed that they were willing to defend the constitution through violent means, mobilizing small forces of armed volunteers. In August 1907, the pro-monarchist prime minister was assassinated outside the parliament building by a money lender from Tabriz, who promptly committed suicide after. The assassin's funeral was said to have been attended by 100,000 mourners to demonstrate support for the revolution. The Shah, intimidated by the zeal and strength of numbers, quickly conceded to the Majlis by vowing to respect the constitution. In the same month, with the country busy with its political transformation, Britain and Russia took advantage by holding a convention whereby they split Persia into zones of influence. The constitutionalists were infuriated that their country's destiny was being decided for them by foreigners. An even bigger issue was arising within Parliament, as the Liberals sought to push forward with far-reaching reforms that would invariably offend the conservative nature of Iranian society. Publications associated with the liberal cause, such as the journal Surei Israfil, put forward the case for secularism by suggesting that the ulama should stay out of politics. But to suggest something so unrealistic not only undermined the constitution, which despite being Belgian-inspired was rooted in Sharia law, but more importantly it would show a great degree of ignorance about the socio-political makeup of the land. It is tough to overstate the degree of authority the ulama hold over Iranian society on a grassroots level. As such, the radical propositions of the liberals began to undermine the unity of the Majlis, as the moderates, with their huge ulama backing, started to become alienated from their constitutionalist brethren. To make matters worse for the Majlis, the economic woes of the country had not improved. Poor harvests and increasing food prices continued. The deputies of the Majlis had announced a budget that, in an attempt to balance the books, actually affected thousands of people employed by the royal court in Tehran. This provided the royalists an opportunity to break its political isolation. Up until late 1907, supporters of the Shah had virtually no voice. Such was the scale of the constitutional victory. The royalists achieved their first major victory when they recruited Sheikh Fazlullah Nouri to their cause. Nouri had originally joined his fellow ulama Behbahani and Tabatabai in supporting the protests of 1906, but had become worried about the secularizing drive of the constitutionalists, who he eventually referred to as heathens. Many Iranian supporters of democracy have since thought of Nouri as a lackey or puppet for the Qajars. But his concerns regarding some of the reforms intended by the constitutionalists had very real grounding amongst the ulama, who feared that these reforms were masking a westernization of Iran's culture. And it's for this reason that the Islamist regime in charge of Iran today ended up revering Sheikh Nouri. For the first time, pro-Shah protests began to be held. By June 1908, the Shah, having recruited more of the public and even a few tribal contingents, was ready to strike back against the Majlis. The Qajars had a trump card, the Cossack Brigade. Modeled after the Cossack regiment of the Russian Imperial Army, it was the most effective military unit in Persia. It was from this brigade that Reza Shah, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, would emerge. With the help of this elite military unit, Muhammad Shah Qajar initiated a coup d'etat whereby the Cossack Brigade bombed the Majlis and subsequently suppressed its members and supporters in the capital. The National Assembly was then dissolved and martial law was declared in Tehran, with the Russian leader of the Cossacks appointed as its military governor. Leading constitutionalists who failed to escape were executed or imprisoned. A period known as the Minor Tyranny inaugurated the return of absolutism. But the capture of Tehran by royalist forces was not decisive. Armed volunteers emerged in defense of the revolution in most major cities, most importantly in Tabriz, which became the main center of resistance. Under the command of Sattar Khan and his lieutenant Bakir Khan, the constitutionalists resisted a force sent by the Shah to bring the city to submission. For 11 months, Tabriz was besieged, with food and provisions not allowed to reach its inhabitants, thus leading to famine-like conditions. Several efforts to break the siege were defeated, including one led by Howard Baskerville, a young American teacher at the American Memorial School, which resulted in his death. Finally, in April 1909, citizens of Tabriz found some relief when Britain, Russia, and France agreed that a Russian force should be sent to occupy the city. But the heroic resistance of Tabriz inspired others throughout the country to similarly take up arms and oppose the Shah. In Esfahan, the Bakhtiyari clan had ousted the Shah's governor and taken control of the city for themselves. Soon they began their march towards Tehran, whilst in the north the forces under Sattar Khan, having been expelled from Tabriz, also marched towards the capital. The royalist position inside Tehran had deteriorated greatly, with the civil war worsening the pre-existing economic crisis. So on July 13, 1909, when constitutionalist forces appeared before the city gates, they were able to assert their dominance over it within 5 days. A makeshift constituent assembly was formed, promptly declaring that Muhammad Ali Shah was to be deposed and replaced with his 12-year-old son, Ahmad. Leading royalists were tried and imprisoned, or as in the case of Sheikh Fazlullah Nouri, executed. The revolution had been rescued. The Majlis resumed its duties with renewed vigor when it reopened in November 1909. It soon negotiated the withdrawal of almost all the Russian troops inside the country's northern provinces, obtained a loan to rebuild the administrative structure, set up a police force known as the Gendarmerie, and recruited an American financial expert by the name of Morgan Schuster to reorganize the tax administration. But as is often the case with Middle Eastern states that initially enter into parliamentary democracy, the Majlis descended into internal conflict. The line separating the moderates and the liberals became more pronounced, as both sides dug their heels in and became less willing to compromise. The issue surrounding religiosity and secularism featured prominently. With the revolution having already turned violent, both sides were now more willing to use violence to advance their cause, turning Tehran into a bloody battleground by the beginning of 1911. Seeing chaos reduce the central government to ineptitude, the provinces erupted in tribal warfare as various tribes and ethnicities tried to assert their own authority on their territories. In an attempt to prevent open warfare, the government announced that all private citizens had to hand in their weapons. The heroes of Tabriz, Sattar Khan and Bakir Khan, along with 300 of their men, refused, leading to a short battle in Atabak Park, in which the government prevailed. There were even attempts by the former Shah, Muhammad Ali, to return to power, but these were defeated. From the outside, European powers watched with great alarm, especially the British, whose oil concession had struck gold when oil was discovered in 1908. On the back of their agreement in 1907, the Russians and the British began moving their troops into the main northern and southern cities respectively. In November 1911, the Russians issued an ultimatum to Parliament: dismiss Schuster, never hire foreign advisors without British and Russian consent, and pay an indemnity for the Russian forces in Iranian cities. For the first time in over a year, the moderates and liberals unanimously agreed on something: to reject the conditions. But the Prime Minister Samsam al-Sultaneh and a few other key figures saw this as futile. What resistance could they offer to a well-trained and ferocious force of over 10,000 Russian soldiers? So the Majlis was dissolved. And just like that, the Persian constitutional revolution was over, weakened by internal fissures and finished off by external pressures. The revolution might have been over, but for the desire and drive of a more representative and efficient form of governance in Iran, this was only the beginning. Over the course of the 20th century, there would be two more major revolutions that sought to achieve the aim set out by the constitutionalists at the beginning of the century. Both of those future events would trace the genealogy of their movements to the constitutional revolution. In 1901, British businessman William Darcy was able to ascertain an oil concession from the Qajar Shah. Over the coming decades, this concession would give way to the creation of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC, which the British government bought a controlling 51% share of in 1914. Ordinary Iranians would remain incredibly unhappy with this deal, despite several revisions in the favor of Iran. The oil concession became the flagship grievance of Iranian nationalists who were more generally opposed to European interference inside their country's affairs. Even when the Qajar dynasty was supplanted by Reza Shah Pahlavis, the situation did not improve enough to conciliate Iranian nationalist demands. The new Shah was an authoritarian nationalist who sought to restore Iran's former glory by adopting European-style modernization. His rule was abruptly cut short when the British forced him to resign in 1941 due to Allied concerns over his neutrality in World War II. He was to be succeeded by his young and inexperienced son, Mohammad Reza Shah. Unlike his father, the new Shah was initially timid. When it came time for the British and Soviet troops that had occupied the country during the war to pull out, the Soviets reneged on their promise unless the Iranian government was prepared to sign a favorable oil agreement with them. But thanks to the skillful diplomacy of Prime Minister Ahmad Kavam, the Soviets would pull out in 1946. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, a wave of decolonization took place throughout the Middle East as the British pulled out their forces. Britain was confronted by the prospect of a changing geopolitical order, in which it was no longer viable for them to maintain a global empire. Having said that, the damage caused by the war made it even more desperate to uphold its overseas business interests by sustaining pivotal projects such as the Suez Canal and the AIOC. Conversely, for nationalists in the Middle East, their desire to nationalize their assets became even greater. Inside the country, Iranians from all strands of society bandied together to call for greater control of their nation's resources. One such Iranian was Mohammad Mossadegh, who will be the protagonist of our story. A liberal politician who was well respected amongst nationalist circles for his defiant stance on nationalizing Iran's oil industry, Mossadegh's vision for Iran brought him into direct conflict with the Shah as he called for a constitutional monarchy in which the Shah reigned but did not rule. Mohammad Reza Shah did not share this vision. He wanted to expand his royal prerogative and work towards being able to exercise even greater authority than he already had. It's important to note that Iran's political scene during this time was incredibly active with various divergent ideologies. There was the Soviet-backed Tudeh party, which was naturally leftist by leaning. They were established in 1941 and were capable of organizing mass protests through the workers and other working-class professions. Then there were the liberals, such as Mossadegh, who wanted some form of democratic governance that was based on the 1906 constitution. There were also royalists, whose interests were intertwined with the monarchies. Finally, there was the ulama and Islamists, whose ability to draw upon their massive support base made them one of the most powerful ideological currents in the country. One particular Islamist group that was very important during the late 40s and early 50s was the Fedayeen-e-Islam, which sought to bring about a system of governance that was closer to the Sharia and devoid of foreign influence. They were extremists in their methodology, using intimidation and assassination as their main means of exerting their influence, with notable victims including the prominent intellectual Ahmad Kasravi and Prime Minister Razmara. Whilst the group was led by Nawab Safavi, its spiritual leader was widely accepted to be Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani. His esteemed position as a marja, the highest level a Shia cleric can attain, helped insulate Fedayeen-e-Islam from repercussions from the law. Kashani was also outspoken in his views criticizing foreign intervention inside Iran and the need to nationalize the oil industry. Even though Mossadegh could be described as a secularist, Kashani would later join in alliance with him in the hope of being able to bring about more Islamist-friendly reforms. In the face of all this ideological activity, the Shah sought to assert his royal power. His opportunity came in 1949. Speaking at the University of Tehran, he was shot several times by a journalist that had ties to both the leftist Tudeh party as well as the Fedayeen Islam. Using the assassin's ties to communists and Islamists, the Shah proclaimed himself to be the victim of a conspiracy by those ideological strands. So he declared martial law, outlawed the Tudeh party, and banned newspapers that were critical of the government. Moreover, the Constituent Assembly of 1949 made changes to the 1906 constitution that favored the Shah, such as the creation of a Senate that was understood to be filled with pro-royalists. Elections would be held in the same year, but these were marred by accusations of rigging as opposition groups criticized the Shah's enlargement of power. A protest movement developed which called for re-elections that soon evolved into the National Front, a coalition of various groups under the leadership of Mossadegh. These groups were united by the desire to maintain civil liberties and a functional government that upheld the constitution. Perhaps most importantly, they held strong grievances against the exploitation of Iran's resources, chiefly oil, by foreign powers. The rescheduled elections went ahead as planned. The National Front was only able to win less than a dozen seats, but their calls for the nationalization of the oil industry was becoming more popular throughout Iranian society. In March 1951, Prime Minister Razmara was assassinated by the Fedayeen Islam. The next month, Mossadegh was chosen by the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, to be Prime Minister. Within a few months, he had nationalized the oil industry, much to the shock of the British. In a bid to not completely alienate them, he offered a 50-50 split with them. The trend of a more equitable split between the native country and foreign powers had already begun decades earlier. Just a year before, Venezuela had split profits equally with foreign companies. But Britain flatly rejected the offer. The public euphoria over reclaiming their treasured resource soon turned to dismay as Iranians found they could not benefit from it. British expertise and equipment were essential in being able to export it in the first place. To make matters worse, Britain declared suffocating sanctions on the sale of Iranian oil, claiming it was stolen property, and pressured other countries not to buy it. The Brits saw the nationalization as a threat to their national security. Mossadegh tried to counter this by reducing his country's dependency on oil, but this proved more difficult in practice and failed. The worsening economic conditions brought great turbulence to Iranian society. This unrest was further aggravated by political developments, as the 1952 parliamentary elections were bogged down by controversy because both the Royalists and National Front accused each other of corruption. In July of that year, the conflict between the Shah and Mossadegh ramped up when the Prime Minister invoked his constitutional prerogative to name the Chief of Staff and Minister of War. The Shah was infuriated and refused, as this was something he had done thus far. He viewed the move as a means of diluting his power to prop up the Majlis. Mossadegh then announced his resignation and appealed directly to the public for support. Hundreds of thousands of National Front supporters responded duly with large-scale protests and demonstrations. He was aided in this by his relationship of convenience with Ayatollah Kashani, who called on Iranians to reject the new Prime Minister Ahmad Kavam. The Shah soon backed down, fearful of the unrest that followed, and reinstated Mossadegh as Prime Minister. He even asked whether he should step down as monarch, but Mossadegh declined. Mossadegh and Kashani's alliance came under stress once the Ayatollah realized the Prime Minister was not interested in Islamist-style reforms. On the contrary, Mossadegh was embracing liberalism. As is often the case in societies experiencing turbulence, Mossadegh was blamed for the worsening political and economic conditions. By mid-1952, street clashes increased. There was even an assassination attempt on his life, to which he responded by jailing numerous political opponents, thereby contributing to people's growing assumption that Mossadegh, the staunch Democrat, was himself becoming dictatorial. When many of his parliamentary supporters resigned, he held a referendum to dissolve the Majlis and rule by executive decree. It passed with a 99% approval rating, a ridiculously high number considering the growing opposition to him. Many Iranians were now convinced regarding their dictatorial assumptions about Mossadegh. Running out of allies, the Prime Minister turned to Tudeh for support. The leftists responded enthusiastically, seeing Mossadegh as a vehicle to reform the country according to their vision. To the displeasure of Mossadegh, however, Tudeh soon turned to violence as they attacked the Prime Minister's opponents. Iran was quickly descending into chaos. To further compound matters, Britain was constantly trying to destabilize Iran from the outside with its economic sanctions, but also from the inside as well. It attempted to bribe key Iranian officials to its cause, and British interference in the 1952 elections was a significant grievance of the National Front. Soon enough, they recruited a reluctant USA to find a way to topple Mossadegh's government and re-establish the former status quo. The US under President Truman had a cautious approach, to the point where they were critical of the British response. This all changed, however, when President Eisenhower came to office in 1953. He took a more assertive approach, especially once the British framed the crisis within the Cold War, with the new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill claiming that a victory for Mossadegh left the country vulnerable to communist encroachment. Mossadegh's alliance with Tudeh served to support this argument. So, from early 1953 onwards, a plan was concocted by the British MI6 and the American CIA spy agencies to prepare the ground for Mossadegh's removal. John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State, worked with his younger brother Alan, the CIA chief, to direct Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt and CIA chief of the Near East and Africa Division, to arrive in Tehran and begin Operation Ajax. Both the MI6 and CIA were given funds by their respective governments to start a propaganda campaign against Mossadegh and even bribed notable figures on the Iranian political scene for their designs. At the same time, they employed unconventional tactics to stir up anti-Mossadegh sentiment. CIA and MI6 operatives pretended to be socialists and intimidated Islamists and royalists in a bid to expedite the reaction against the Prime Minister from Iranians themselves. Considering Mossadegh's growing unpopularity, the ground was fertile enough for Operation Ajax to begin on August 15th. It should be mentioned that the CIA and MI6 role in this plan was to help create the conditions for regime change. The actual downfall of Mossadegh's government would have to be done by Iranians themselves. The Shah was persuaded to dismiss Mossadegh, something he was initially hesitant about considering the consequences the year before when he attempted such an action. General Fazlullah Zahidi was appointed as his replacement. This failed, however, probably because Mossadegh was warned beforehand, as the Prime Minister saw thousands of his supporters take to the streets. The Shah, fearing for his life, fled to Baghdad. Later documents reveal that the Americans also believed it to have failed and ordered Roosevelt to leave the country, but the CIA operative decided to stay and try again, reportedly because he did not receive the message to leave in time. More importantly, General Zahedi also continued his efforts by meeting with pro-Shah supporters such as Ayatollah Behbahani and others to create a new plan of action. What they came up with was to ensure maximal confusion and chaos, so on August 19th, they hired people to pose as Tudeh party members who would announce the onset of a communist revolution. Subsequently, this group was enthusiastically joined by actual Tudeh members and started looting private businesses and shops because they were symbols of capitalism according to them. With a big part of Tehran being vandalized and ruined, many inside the city were horrified, which fed directly into the next phase of the plan. A second group of paid infiltrators posing as pro-royalists organized scared and angry crowds to repulse the apparent communist revolution. Some of these paid infiltrators were known criminals from the ghetto of South Tehran, such as Brainless Shaban, a big brute of a man. The two sets of groups began fighting amongst themselves, even with improvised weapons. At this point, General Zahedi ordered the army to aid the anti-communist crowd and fight off the Tudeh members. In the process, They stormed government buildings and even went after Mossadegh. The embattled prime minister turned himself into the army's custody to prevent further bloodshed. This left General Zahedi, a staunch royalist, and the army in charge of the government. The Shah, who was in Italy at this point, returned to Iran joined by CIA chief Allen Dulles upon hearing of the coup's result. Zahedi would become the new prime minister. Mossadegh would be tried and originally sentenced to death, but the Shah commuted this to 3 years of solitary confinement and then house arrest until his death. The coup would prove incredibly consequential for both the Shah and the US. Mohammad Reza Shah benefited greatly from it, at least in the short term. He came out of it having achieved his aim of concentrating power in his hands, as he would go on to rule as an autocrat for the next 25 years. On top of this, Iran came out of it with greater control of its oil, as the Consortium Agreement of 1954 determined Iranians would receive 50% of the ownership, whilst the other half was split between the Dutch, French, British, and Americans. The AIOC would be renamed to BP, British Petroleum, which is still a major oil company today. The resumption of trade meant an influx of money that the Shah could use to stabilize and subsequently modernize his country. For the Americans, they were able to establish a friendly government as well as gain a foothold within the profitable Iranian oil industry. However, both of these benefactors would pay the price in the end. The Shah was viewed as a Western puppet by many of his subjects. His complicity in the 1953 coup was a key reason for this. American involvement in Mossadegh's downfall poisoned the future prospects for fruitful relations between the two countries, as Iranians realized just how dangerous it was to deal with the US. For many in the country, their negative experiences with the British combined with the 1953 coup forced them to see America as just another imperialist country that sought to exploit their country for its own benefit. This was perhaps the first example of American involvement in regime change in the Middle East, and it set a precedent for the future. The same conclusions that many ordinary Iranians reached about the perils of dealing with America would also be gained in various other countries of the region throughout the second half of the 20th century. All of these tropes would surface violently in 1978, when revolutionary sentiment took a grip of Iran's political scene once again. That time, however, the Shah's reign and rule were brought to an end, permanently. So too were relations with the US. With the spirit of reform being dampened by the consolidation of royalist power, Mohammad Reza Shah took a more hands-on approach to ruling. Putting his sympathizers in positions of power, the Shah sought to strengthen his rule through nepotism by encouraging the court patronage system. He rapidly became more tyrannical as well, establishing the secret police Savak in 1957. Which would go on to terrorize Iranian citizens that were suspected of subverting the Shah's rule. Savak's ruthless brutality fostered significant resentment that would manifest itself in 1979. Subsequently, the Shah was unpopular with many segments of society. For secularists, he had subverted the 1906 constitution, whilst for the ulama, the Shah's drive to westernize Iran was unacceptable. He did, however, have good relations with one Ayatollah, Hussein Burujerdi. He was a marja, the highest level a Shia cleric can attain, and one who can make legal decisions according to the Sharia. Politically, he was famous for adopting an approach where he maintained public silence on state matters. One of his students at the Hawza of Qom was none other than Ruhollah Khomeini, the man who would go on to lead the 1979 revolution. His future revolutionary student had to observe this silence for as long as Burujerdi was alive. But in 1961, he would die. His pupil, Khomeini, was now ready to emerge on the national stage. His opportunity would come 2 years later in 1963. The Shah, in an effort to weaken the traditional classes of society, launched the White Revolution. This consisted mainly of land reforms, but extended to the social sphere by allowing women to vote as well as forming a literacy corps to reduce illiteracy. With his reforms, he hoped to gain favor with the peasant and working class, but only succeeded in creating new social tensions, as the reforms had emboldened the growth of the intelligentsia and urban workers. As these two classes grew in importance, so too did their voices. The Shah had already undermined them by removing independent newspapers and trade unions. In June 1963, Khomeini delivered a sermon in Qom where he denounced the White Revolution and the Shah as a Western puppet who had violated the constitution and spread moral corruption. He was promptly arrested, which triggered widespread protests from his supporters. Khomeini would narrowly escape the death penalty when he was promoted to the position of marja. He would be released the next year and then exiled to Iraq for the next 14 years. In this interim period, the Shah strengthened his grip on power. It should be mentioned that Iran did develop considerably in this time period, thanks to economic plans implemented by the Shah. Industrial output soared as power plants, dams, and factories for the steel and car industries proliferated. This rapid industrialization saw asphalted roads being built connecting the major cities, thousands of schools being constructed in both urban and rural areas, and improvements in the health services which helped the population balloon from 19 million in 1956 to 33 million in 1976. These advancements also facilitated a burgeoning middle class that likely accounted for 10% of the population on the eve of the Islamic Revolution. In education, great progress was also made. Elementary schooling was made free and compulsory, whilst higher education was supported through the construction of universities and sending students abroad. Whilst the Shah left Savak to ensure Iran's domestic security, he also sought to secure the country from external threats. So he invested heavily into the military, spending billions of dollars to make sure, as he put it, nobody can wave a finger at us because we will wave back. As the Iranian military quickly became one of the strongest in the world, the Shah undoubtedly remembered that in 1941 his father had been ousted from power by a superior military force. Since the ascension of the Qajars in the late 18th century, Iran had been dictated to by outside powers. The Shah sought to bring an end to this. All of this development was made possible by the enormous revenues from oil. From 1963 to 1977, Iran achieved an annual GDP growth greater than 10%, a truly astounding feat. In 1973, the Shah fully nationalized the country's oil industry, to the severe displeasure of Western companies that shared in the spoils. In the same year, war broke out between Israel and Egypt and Syria. Outraged by continued Western support for the Israelis, Saudi Arabia led Arab oil-producing nations to proclaim an embargo of oil to the allies of Israel, including the USA. This forced the price of oil to increase by 300% within a year. The Shah was integral in calling for this rise in price. This highlights a key yet underrated trend, that by the 1970s, the Shah was becoming noticeably independent from the West. This included taking actions that championed Iran's strategic interests, even if they were at the detriment of his American allies. In 1976, he proudly proclaimed, "Now we are the masters, and our former masters are our slaves. Every day they beat a track to our door begging for favors. How can they be of assistance? Do we want arms? Do we want nuclear power stations? We only have to answer, and they will fulfill our wishes." But for Iranians, it did not matter. His reputation as a puppet ruler had been indelibly marked with the 1953 coup against Mossadegh. Although the country progressed greatly in the 1960s and 70s, this development was uneven as the few at the top who were in royal favor hoarded a large amount of the incoming money. This included the royal family, who many Iranians accused of siphoning billions of dollars through its business interests. The country's economy was modeled in a way where money was supposed to trickle down from the top to the bottom. But what ended up happening was wealth was bottlenecked at the top and remained in the hands of the elite. As a result, the gap between the rich and the poor was becoming very distinct. Analysts and modern historians would be quick to tell you that this widening gap can create the perfect storm for revolutionary sentiment to brew. To mark the 2,500-year anniversary of continuous Persian monarchy, the Shah held a lavish celebration in 1971. He might have elevated Iran's status internationally with the ceremony, but domestically, for many ordinary Iranians, it only served to highlight the moral decay of the Pahlavi regime. The corrupt nature of the Shah's rule was bitterly resented by not only the ulama, who were viewed by many Iranians as caring more about the welfare of the ordinary citizens than the government, but also the middle class and intelligentsia. The Shah's modern education reforms had created a blossoming intelligentsia, many of whom could be counted amongst the middle class. They'd likely have professions attained through education. They saw their professional prospects suffer at the hands of a nepotistic system. Those who were favored by the regime received lucrative contracts and positions facilitated by the oil boom. From an ideological perspective, the Shah's rule unsettled many different strands. Leftists were angered by his patronage of a small group of elites to hoard most of the nation's wealth. Liberals and nationalists were offended by his heavy-handedness and lack of respect for the 1906 constitution. Islamists were abhorred by the prospect of his westernization undermining traditional Islamic norms, as well as the warm relations with Israel and the United States. Writers and philosophers such as Jalal Ali Ahmad wrote of Gharbzadegi, or Westoxification, the idea that the West had intoxicated Iran with its toxins, be it in the shape of moral laxity or obsession with money. Ahmad's ideas would go on to influence Ali Shariati. Referred to as the ideologue of the Islamic Revolution, he called for a revolutionary brand of Shi'ism that would tackle social injustice, thereby making him hugely popular amongst Islamists and socialists. Savak violently repressed these elements that went against their patron, further stoking hatred of the Pahlavis and strengthening the hand of the powerful and vocal ulama. The ulama were outraged when the Shah changed the calendar in 1976 to start with the ascension of the ancient Persian ruler Cyrus the Great rather than the Islamic Hijri one. To quote historian Ervand Abrahamian, Iranians jumped overnight from the Muslim year 1355 to the royalist year 2535. To them, this was yet another example of his secularism. In 1975, the Shah formed the Hizb-i Rastakhiz and made it the only legal political party in the country. Every Iranian was required to join it, angering all the aforementioned ideological currents. Despite his attempts to portray himself as a great Iranian leader, more and more of the nation were turning against Muhammad Reza Shah. The immediate lead up to the revolution can be seen from around 1977 onwards. Despite the huge revenues coming in from oil, Prime Minister Amir Abbas Hoveyda was confronted by the prospect of increasing inflation in the economy. His solution was to take it out on the Bazaris. At the same time, the Shah was being pressured by the new US President Jimmy Carter to mend his human rights record. American policymakers were likely concerned by the Shah's growing independence and his role in the raising of oil prices. Western newspapers and NGOs were quick to highlight Iran's poor human rights situation. Iran's geopolitical status was of the utmost importance to the Shah, who wanted to recapture the glory of past Persian empires. So under international pressure, he relented and allowed for political liberalisation to take place. Clamoring amongst intellectual circles increased as the fear of Savak died down. Then, a fascinating chain of events took place that saw Iran stumble its way into a revolution. Later that year, the influential writer Ali Shariati and Ayatollah Khomeini's son Mustafa both died in mysterious circumstances. Many in Iran put the blame on the Pahlavis. The death of his son put Khomeini back on the national stage as mourning ceremonies were held for Mustafa. In January 1978, an anonymous article was published in the pro-Pahlavi Itteleat national newspaper, which denounced Khomeini as a foreign agent and went on to note that his ancestors had in fact moved back from India in the 19th century. The editorial provoked outrage. A few thousand seminary students in Qom took to the streets and persuaded local bazaars to close down. The demonstrations ended when security forces began to shoot protesters. Dozens of people were killed, shocking the nation. In accordance with Shia customs, memorial services were held 40 days later. So 6 weeks later, the students were commemorated in various cities. Demonstrations followed shortly afterwards. The largest of these was in Tabriz, which descended into a riot where institutions connected to the government or the West were targeted. Cinemas, bars, and police stations were set ablaze. The army was sent in to forcefully quell the chaos, killing several protesters. 40 days later, similar demonstrations were staged in various cities once again. This pattern repeated itself numerous times and was massively consequential. Whilst the ulama, including Khomeini from his exile in Iraq, spearheaded these protests, they were effective due to their traditional alliance with the Bazaris who contributed by going on strike. The Shah persisted with his political liberalisation, relaxing censorship and promising democratic elections would be held the next year in 1979. Due to a lack of training as well as the sheer scale of these demonstrations, the police force proved inept in bringing order. So the Shah relied on his powerful army to defuse the situation, but with instructions to not use excessive force. Considering emotions were running high due to decades of systematic repression, this was always going to prove difficult. By the beginning of summer 1978, it seemed as if the Shah's repeated concessions to the protesters were working. He had removed Savak and government officials that the people particularly opposed. Demonstrations grew fewer and fewer. But by August, economic shortcomings, coupled with the fact that it was Ramadan, strengthened the hands of the ulama to call for renewed protests against the government. This succeeded as Iran's major cities were brought to standstills by massive strikes and demonstrations. The Shah, encouraged by his previous appeasement's supposed success, continued to conciliate the opposition. In reality, he misunderstood the dynamics. He had made foes of too many people for too long to cool the fury that motivated their anti-establishment sentiment. In essence, it was too little too late. So even when the government abolished the one-party state, even when it restored the Islamic calendar, even when it allowed freedom of expression, even when it began to prosecute corrupt government officials, all it did was further encourage the opposition. The ulama, especially Ayatollah Khomeini, emerged as the leaders of this anti-Shah movement. Iran's domestic stability continued eroding. In August, the Cinema Rex movie theatre was burned down by arsonists in the oil-important city of Abadan, killing more than 400 people. The government was forced to state that it was not involved in the face of accusations from Khomeini and others that it was responsible for it. These pleas of innocence fell on deaf ears as revolutionary fervour had reached fever pitch, even though some analysts believed the arsonists were in fact Islamists. A few days after Eid al-Fitr, in September 1978, Black Friday took place, where the military shot and killed up to 100 protesters after ignoring the Shah's imposition of martial law. For many in the country, conciliation with the Shah's regime was no longer an option. The next month, a nationwide general strike was called which brought a halt to the economy. Recognizing the weakness of his position, the Shah took no action against this. In the meantime, he had pressured Saddam Hussein to expel Khomeini from Najaf, a key Shia city that held deep-rooted ties to the Shias of Iran. So in November, Khomeini moved to a village near Paris, France. From there, he was able to generate greater exposure for the Iranian protest movement through the Western media. The move clearly backfired on the Shah, who wanted to disconnect Khomeini from his support base. Instead, the intense coverage he received made Khomeini the most influential Ayatollah. To the Western media, he was an apolitical spiritual figurehead. This is because Khomeini strategically focused on issues such as social injustice and corruption, whilst hiding any mention of his intentions to create a theocratic state. He had written a book in 1970, Vilayat-i Faqih, meaning guardianship of the jurist, which argued Islamic jurists should be responsible as political guardians in order to ensure the country was being run according to the Sharia. His omission of this served to dupe not only the West, but Iranians themselves, seeing as the coalition against the Shah was very broad. So he focused on a socio-economic critique of the Shah rather than the proposed solution of rule by Islamic jurists. Meanwhile in Iran, protests started to turn into riots as the army and police felt powerless due to the indecision of their leaders. The Shah had created a centralized system that was dependent on him, so if he floundered, so too did the whole system. In 1974, he had been diagnosed with cancer, from which he would eventually die in 1980. His French doctors had prescribed him anti-cancer drugs which are known to impair mental faculties by causing depression and anxiety. Regardless of the reason, the Shah was being indecisive and it played right into the hands of the opposition. Eventually, he formed a military government which started to take more assertive action. In December, during the Islamic month of Muharram, huge protests were organized by Islamists to commemorate Ashura, the day the third Imam, Hussein ibn Ali, was martyred. Estimates for involvements in these protests go as high as 9 million people, more than the French and Russian revolutions. The demonstrations were symbolically led by Ayatollah Taleghani and the secular Democrat National Front leader Karim Sanjabi. Whilst Islamists were essential to the planning of the revolution, by this point liberal and leftist groups were intimately involved in the opposition. In fact, the main leftist group, the Tudeh Party, had a prominent history of being anti-establishment. Their rise worried America, which has led some people to accuse the US for aiding Khomeini once the writing was on the wall regarding the Pahlavi regime's downfall. The Shah would leave the country, never to return, on January 16, 1979. Iran became the scene of intense celebrations as signs of the monarchy were torn down by the crowds. Before he left, he had appointed Shapur Bakhtiar as Prime Minister. Bakhtiar rejected the dominance of the ulama in politics, and he was promptly expelled from the National Front for accepting the position. On February 1st, Khomeini returned to Iran after 14 years and was welcomed by hundreds of thousands of enthusiastic supporters. Never one to mince his words, the Ayatollah made it clear he rejected Bakhtiar's government. On February 5th, he declared a provisional revolutionary government with the moderate Muslim and nationalist Mehdi Bazargan as the Prime Minister. The fact that he was even able to do this showed who was really in charge. After a period of tension between the two rival governments, which involved small armed battles, pro-Khomeini forces won as the army declared its neutrality. On February 11th, Bakhtiar escaped Iran, only to be assassinated 12 years later by agents of the Islamic Republic in Paris. And with this, the revolution had succeeded. The protests which had begun 13 months prior had brought down a monarchy. But as is often the case with revolutions, the aftermath revolves around a consolidation of authority by removing potential threats. What ensued was essentially a power grab by Khomeini and his Islamic fundamentalist loyalists. Throughout 1979, Khomeini set up a number of revolutionary bodies that quickly overshadowed the authority of Prime Minister Bazargan. Despite having massive popular support, Khomeini's movement did not have an official militant wing, so in May, he established the Revolutionary Guard to safeguard the Islamic Revolution. After the Shah was admitted to the US for cancer treatment, the Islamists demanded that he be extradited to Iran to stand trial for his crimes. The demand was rejected, thereby leading to the Iran hostage crisis on November 4th, when student followers of Ayatollah Khomeini took over the US embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage. This led to Prime Minister Bazargan's resignation and was significant in securing Islamist control, although it did poison the prospect of fruitful relations between Iran and America, as the latter would later cut diplomatic relations as well as impose damaging economic sanctions on the regime. In December, a constitutional referendum was held where the Islamic choice was selected by more than 99% of the voters. This was supported both by the leftist Taudeh and liberal pro-democrats, unable to see what the future held for them. Ayatollah Khomeini gained the venerable position of supreme leader, and over the next few years, he removed his erstwhile allies one by one as he neutralized leftists, liberals, and even Islamists that did not conform to his viewpoints, including Ayatollah Shariat Madari, the man who had saved his life in 1964 when he secured his promotion to the rank of Marja. At the same time, widespread executions of the Pahlavi regime's civil servants also took place after brief sham trials. In January 1980, Abul Hassan Bani Sadr was elected president, a moderate who would go on to clash with Khomeini about the role of the ulama in politics before being impeached in June 1981. From 1980 until 1983, the Islamic Republic launched the Inqilabi Farhangi, or Cultural Revolution, to stamp out dissident thought amongst institutions of higher education. Universities were shut down for this period. Higher education was filled with leftists and secularists that were deemed a threat to Khomeini's vision for a theocracy. Students and teachers were purged. As a result, many Iranians fled abroad, thereby hurting the country's future prospects because of the loss of job skills and capital. Opposition groups took matters into their own hands, with the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, or MEK, launching a string of high-profile attacks in 1981 on Islamist government officials that included high-ranking members. But it was too late. Khomeini's stranglehold on power was complete. His spiritual authority gave him the ability to label anyone who went against him as munafiqs, or even worse, kafirs. In a strange twist, Iraq's invasion of Iran in September 1980 helped Islamist control as the nation's attention turned to defending itself against a foreign aggressor. The war would drag on for 8 long years and would do untold damage to Iran's economy and demographics, as hundreds of billions of dollars were spent and hundreds of thousands dying. But the war, one of the deadliest in the 20th century, had allowed Khomeini and his Islamists to complete the consolidation of their authority. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was remarkable to say the least. The rate at which it developed and the sheer level of participation shocked most observers at the time. People of different ideological persuasions banded together to remove a regime which was ubiquitously criticized for being corrupt and unjust. But the optimism from its revolutionary success soon turned to horror as it was hijacked by Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamists. The repression exercised by the Islamic Republic in the aftermath of 1979 was in many ways identical to the Shah's, perhaps even greater. Today, Iran is ruled by Khomeini's successor, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who seeks to uphold the system created by his predecessor. Since the establishment of the Islamic Republic, there have been numerous widespread protest movements against the government's policies, all of which have been put down. But Iran's modern history clearly shows that if the people are not content with their rulers, then it's only a matter of time before they rise up and manifest their will. The Islamic Republic should know this better than anyone. Thanks for tuning in. As usual, I want to give a big shout out to my Patreons for continuing to support me financially. If you're interested in helping Hikmah History financially, there's a link to my Patreon in the description to this video and in the end screen. And last but not least, I want to thank my friend Azim for his help on this script. Until next time, peace!